So this is the last part of this book on thriving cities under climate change, and this is about how to get it done, the urban resilience, greenness and inclusivity. Chapter 5, Policies for Promoting Green, Resilient and Inclusive Urban Development. No matter where you are in life, there is always a long journey ahead. Nelson Mandela, one great guy. Main findings of how do we get it done. World Bank's GRID, Green, Resilient and Inclusive Development approach, adds a sustainability lens to its pursuit of the twin goals of ending extreme poverty and creating shared prosperity. This report aligns with the GRID approach in its description of how green, how resilient and how inclusive cities are, and in the analytics of how climate change affects cities and vice versa. This prescriptive chapter mirrors that alignment. Okay, so there are some prescriptions given here on how to get this done. Because of the complexity of the subject, this chapter presents the general conclusions in the form of 3 questions that policymakers should answer. What policy instruments are available? Who wields these instruments? How can policy choices based on the use of these instruments be prioritized and sequenced for effective implementation? So we talked about this a little in the summary of the book as well. What, who and how, that's what matters. Policy options take form of 5 I's. By the way, these 5 I's, I only read the first one. There are similar set of indices to be tracked for incentives, insurance, integration and investments, which I didn't read, which you should read for sure if you're interested. So policy options take the form of 5 I's: information, incentives, insurance, integration and investments. Their order represents a sequencing of bundles of interventions. In many instances, the interdependencies between these sets of instruments play out in complementary ways, wherein policies across the bundles strengthen impact when implemented together. Who? Because traditional urban stresses interact with climate change related stresses to determine outcomes, local governments are well placed to drive climate action. Cities, working with other stakeholders, including national governments, the private sector, and civil society, have a large policy wedge at their disposal. That's their leverage, right? How? Policymakers will need to toggle between and sandwich together the bundles of policy options described in this chapter to arrive at the GRID outcomes. I'm not going to go into the details of the chapter. I'll just read a few key points, but you should read if you are interested in what this all means in terms of toggling between and sandwiching together the bundles of policy options. The combinations of interventions, their sequencing and the prioritization of outcomes will vary depending on the characteristics of cities, including primarily their level of risk, level of development and size. Okay, so incentives will encourage people and firms to properly factor in climate change risks, and government officials to address the challenges of pursuing green, resilient and inclusive development. Integration, I won't read this in order. Integration within cities, integrated planning promotes more compact, energy efficient development. Mixed neighborhoods and other ideas exist in urban planning. Insurance, people, firms and governments can insure against losses associated with climate change and against unavoidable environmental shocks and stresses. Investments in green, resilient and inclusive infrastructure, including in nature-based solutions, can help cities address climate change related risks. Okay, let's read some boxes. Building water secure cities using information, incentives and investments. So it's a good example. Dimensions of adaptability of the public-private dialogue here: area, scope, institutionalization, leadership, ownership, focus and participation. So this has national and local dimensions, economy-wide or sector-specific scope, permanent institution or temporary initiative, public-driven or private-driven, third-party brokerage and support or locally driven and sustained. That's in terms of ownership. In terms of focus, general orientations, many goals, specific changes, specific goal, many actors and few actors participation wise. Okay, so building water secure cities, then cities can strengthen their water supplies and increase access by diversifying available water sources. For example, cities can embrace the idea of reusing and recycling wastewater and harvesting stormwater as alternative sources of water supply. In cities across India, these have become mandated now, even though they are not enforced, I think, fully. By returning water back into the economy, they can capture its full value as a service, an input to process, a source of energy, and a carrier of nutrients and other materials. There are ideas of circular economy in water supply and so on as well. Such an approach will help cities hedge against water risks while reducing resource extraction and environmental degradation. Reused water can also benefit streams, rivers, lakes, wetlands, and aquifers, in part because the excess water returned to natural systems is of better quality than standard treated wastewater. Okay, so this is a bit long, so we'll just kind of sample it. Principles for defining the role of national and city governments in climate mitigation and adaptation. It comes to setting targets, planning and implementation, financing and capacity building. So just examples: setting targets, define high-level greenhouse gas reduction and climate adaptation targets by sector and territory, and city governments can then elaborate detailed local targets consistent with the national goals based on local conditions, economic specialization, development challenges, major greenhouse gas contributors, and exposure to climate and other disaster risks. Remember, adaptation is always local, so even within a nation, you have to go down to those levels. In this case, focus on cities, of course. Planning and implementation requires establishing critical national policy frameworks across all 5 I's that we talked about. Cities will need to maximize the use of traditional urban functions for climate adaptation and mitigation, land use and transportation planning, utilities management, urban infrastructure development and management, urban service provisions, and disaster response planning and preparedness. Of course, there is engaging local community and businesses, which is very critical. Financing nationally, using national schemes for financing urban infrastructure, subnational grants, incentivizing investments and programs that maximize adaptation and mitigation contributions. Well, city governments will use all available options for maximizing financial resources for local climate action while ensuring the sustainability of municipal debt obligations. The following options should be considered if appropriate: using land value capture schemes such as development fees, infrastructure level levies, tax increment financing, and value-based land and taxation, and so on. And capacity building: nationally, set standards for local climate strategies and policies and provide sufficient technical and capacity building support to help local governments achieve them. Coming to local governments, build public-private partnerships to leverage the capacities of local private sector and academia for advancing local climate action. Okay, so obviously I'm just sampling each item here, but you should read the details if that's of interest. We'll just conclude this, even if it's a bit longer. The importance of voice in decision making. Women can be change agents in their communities. As Chapter 3 demonstrated, women's needs and opinions are critical when planning for the provision of water services to water scarce informal urban areas that are not, gated communities, high rises with rich people, and so on, like slums, in water resilience planning and in water recovery measures. Yet, women are still heavily underrepresented in the water workforce and in decision-making roles in water use associations, water user associations, and local governments, despite being disproportionately affected by inadequate water provision. Women who lots of times stay at home and take care of family need water, and they are mostly dealing with water issues, even including drudgery sometimes of getting water from far and so on. Are workers prepared for the green transition? This is critical because many of the problems arise because the green transition happens like economic transitions, automation, globalization, etc., that leave some worker sections behind, and then they become discontented, and then they begin to make wrong choices during elections and so on, which played out in a very bad way in some countries, for example. The transition to green economic activities and the use of green technologies will depend on the skills of the population. The transition away from coal, combined with the ongoing technological disruption and digital transformation, will have a profound impact on the employment landscape over the coming years. Okay, there are many such examples, the details that one can go into, but workers that face redundancy and are not trained, retrained, and prepared for the transition will end up becoming vulnerable to the economy, productivity, and so on. Finally, just read the way urban centers have grown. Between 1970 and 2021, the number of people living in cities increased from 1.19 billion to 4.46 billion, while the Earth's surface temperature climbed by 1.2 degrees Celsius above its pre-industrial levels. Because of the prosperity they have helped generate, cities have been a major cause of this climate change. However, it's also in cities that many of the solutions to the climate crisis in terms of both adaptation and mitigation will be found, not least because by 2050 almost 70% of the world's population will call cities home. As such, cities are the key to arguably the greatest public policy challenge of our times. To take stock of how green, how resilient, and how inclusive cities globally are today, thriving, making cities green, resilient, and inclusive in a changing climate defines a global typology of more than 10,000 cities. It finds that there is a wide variation in how green, resilient, and inclusive cities are around the world. It asks how climate change impacts cities and conversely how cities affect climate. Vicious cycles in development could occur as cities become more vulnerable to extreme events, and the challenges compound and cascade. Finally, this report provides a compass for policy makers on policies that can help cities not only survive but also thrive in the face of the perils of climate change. Policymakers can and must act now to chart a more sustainable trajectory. Okay, so if I find more material on urban resilience, greenness, and inclusivity, I'll include later, but for now this is the end of this report in terms of summarizing it in podcasts. Now I'll move to maybe adaptation through the Holocene. Okay.